I should have died with the rest of them. That thought stayed with me long after the world ended. Long after the sky turned black and the streets above melted into something unrecognizable. But fate, or some cruel joke of the universe, had other plans. I was late for work. That was all. One missed alarm, one groggy morning, one agonizing decision to grab a coffee before catching the train. That delay saved my life. Or maybe it just postponed the inevitable. I was stepping onto the subway platform when the siren started. A distant wail, rising over the noise of the city like some ancient thing awakening. No one moved at first. Sirens were common. Drills, alerts, all part of the endless background hum of paranoia. But this time was different. This time the ground shook. The first blast wasn't something we saw. It was something we felt. A deep, stomach-churning tremor that rippled through the station, followed by a gust of hot air screaming down the tunnel. A moment later, the overhead lights flickered and died. Then came a sound, a low, groaning wail, as if the city itself had been struck in the chest. The kind of sound that sends every instinct into a frenzy, that drags some primal terror up from the depths of your mind where it has been buried since the days when men still huddled in caves. And then collapse. A chunk of the ceiling gave way near the escalators, sending a wave of dust and debris into the station. Someone screamed. The ground jolted again, and then the main tunnel caved in, swallowing the tracks whole in a roar of stone and steel. It happened so fast, I barely remember moving. 1 second, I was watching in horror as the station crumbled around me. The next, I was on my hands and knees, coughing up dust, struggling to breathe. The emergency lights flickered to life, bathing everything in sickly red. Shapes moved through the haze, people staggering, choking, reaching out blindly for something solid to hold on to. There was no train, no way out. We were buried alive. The first hours were chaos. There were maybe 40 of us in the station when the blast hit. Some had been on the platform, waiting for the next train. Others were already inside, trapped in the cars when the tunnel collapsed. Those people were the first to die. The ones near the front, closest to the impact, gone instantly, crushed beneath tons of concrete. The rest? They screamed, cried out from the twisted wreckage. Some tried to help, clawing at the debris with bleeding hands, but it was useless. The train had become a tomb. I don't remember how long we stood there, stunned, waiting for rescue that would never come. The world outside was silent. No sirens, no distant voices calling for survivors. Just the occasional creak of shifting metal, the soft patter of dust falling from above. And then, the real horror began. The first fight broke out over bottled water. It had been sitting inside an abandoned bag, forgotten near one of the benches. Someone grabbed it. Someone else saw and lunged. It took less than a minute for two men to be at each other's throats. No one stopped them. That was the moment it sank in. There were no rules anymore. No police. No laws. Just hunger, thirst, and a gnawing dread that none of us were getting out alive. We found food in the station's vending machines, enough to last a couple of days if we rationed carefully. But water? That was different. The taps weren't running. And whatever sat stagnant in the maintenance rooms smelled like something had been rotting in the pipes long before the world ended. Some of us still clung to the idea that help was coming. They talked in hushed voices about emergency responders, about rescue teams digging their way down to us. Those people didn't last long. The ones who survived, the ones who understood, we started to change. We stopped speaking in full sentences. Words became unnecessary. It was the eyes that mattered. The quick glances, the unspoken agreements. We scavenged in silence. We moved in silence. We slept in shifts, always aware that someone might try to slit our throats for a sip of water. People began disappearing. Sometimes it was slow, a shadow slipping between the platforms, a set of footsteps moving away in the darkness. Other times it was fast, a struggle, a muffled scream, and then nothing. And still, the air grew heavier. It was on the third, or maybe fourth, day that I realized the dust wasn't settling. The air had changed. It had taken on a weight, a thickness that coated my lungs, and made every breath feel like I was inhaling something not meant for human consumption. Some of us started coughing, not just from the dust, but from something deeper, something rotten. That was when the rumors started. Someone whispered that the surface was worse, that the bombs had broken something open, something that was never meant to be exposed. Radiation, toxins, things we couldn't see but could feel crawling inside us. Another man claimed he had seen something in the tunnels. Not a survivor, not a person, something else. I didn't believe him. Not at first. Then I heard the scratching. The station had gone quiet. No more fights. No more hushed voices. Just a soft shuffle of bodies moving in the dark, conserving energy, waiting for something to change. That was when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound coming from the collapsed tunnel. At first, I thought it was a survivor, someone buried under the rubble, trying to dig their way out. But no, it wasn't coming from under the rubble. It was coming from beyond it. A slow, deliberate scratching, like nails against stone. I wasn't the only one who heard it. I saw the others react, the tightening of jaws, the stiffening of shoulders. No one spoke, but we all understood. Something was moving in the dark, and it was trying to get in. The last thing I remember before I stopped counting time was the sound of the steel gates near the stairwells being dragged shut. Someone had decided it was safer to be locked in than to risk whatever was on the other side. I wasn't so sure, because as the gates clanged shut and the echoes faded into the darkness, I swore I could still hear the scratching. And this time it was closer. We weren't alone down there. For the first few days, we believed we were the last ones left, a handful of survivors clawing at the walls of a buried tomb. But the tunnels went deeper than we thought. There were paths beneath the station, winding corridors carved into the city's foundation, places no commuter had ever seen. We weren't the first to find them. Others had been there long before us. They had survived in the dark, huddled in the old maintenance routes, living off whatever scraps they had hoarded. They had food, water, weapons cobbled together from rusted pipes and shattered glass. Their eyes had adjusted to the darkness, their voices reduced to whispers. They had made the tunnels their home, and they didn't trust outsiders. They let us in, but only barely. We were too many, too desperate, and they had seen what desperation did to people. Some of them had been here since the first impact, long enough to understand that survival wasn't just about food or water. It was about silence. It was about staying unseen, because the tunnels weren't empty. Radiation had poisoned the air, but that wasn't all it had done. Something worse had happened. The deeper we went, the heavier it became. Not just the dust, but the feeling of it, the weight of something unseen pressing in from all sides. The others spoke of it in hushed tones, though they never said it outright. They didn't need to. The fear was in their movements, in the way their eyes darted toward the unlit passages, in the way they recoiled from shadows that should have been empty. There had been others, they said. More survivors. A scouting party had gone into the tunnels days ago, searching for an exit, a way to the surface. None of them returned. They should have been dead. But sometimes, in the long hours between sleep and waking, their voices could be heard. Not calling for help, just calling. I didn't believe them at first. Stories, rumors, things people tell themselves when the dark gets too deep and the silence stretches too long. But then the scratching started again. It wasn't coming from the collapsed station anymore. It had moved. It was inside the tunnels now. At first, it was faint, a distant skittering, too rhythmic to be rats, too careful to be random. It came from the maintenance corridors, from behind sealed grates and broken doors, from the depths of passageways that no one had dared to map. Then it got closer. The sound wasn't just scratching anymore. It was clawing, slow, methodical, testing the barriers we had placed. A dragging sound followed, something heavy pulling itself through the darkness, brushing against the old, rusted pipes. One night, I woke to something tapping against the vent near my head. 3 sharp raps, a pause, then 3 more. It knew I was there. We tried to block the tunnels. It wasn't enough. Whatever was moving in the dark wasn't scavenging. It was hunting. The first to disappear was a man who had been keeping watch near the northern passage. One moment he was there, standing by the barricades, his breath visible in the cold. The next, he was gone. The others swore they had only looked away for a second. No sound, no straged, just empty space where he had been. We searched, though none of us wanted to. A few men ventured deeper, carrying torches made from old rags and oil-soaked wood. They followed the tunnel down past the main shafts, through the maintenance corridors where the air was thickest. They came back pale and shaking. They found nothing, but the dust on the ground, thick layers of undisturbed filth, was wrong. Something had been dragged, something heavy. The streaks led into a passage too narrow for any man to fit through. And the walls, they were wet. The stories changed after that. It wasn't just whispers in the dark anymore. It wasn't just missing scouts or strange sounds in the vents. The others had a name for them now, though none of them dared to say it. The deep ones. They had once been people. That much was certain. But time, hunger, and something else had changed them. Radiation burns. Open sores that never healed. Skin that had blackened, cracked, stretched too tightly over elongated limbs. The bones had shifted, grown in ways they weren't meant to. Fingers too long, nails too thick, teeth too sharp. And the eyes. Gone. Hollowed out. But they could still see. No one knew how many there were. Only that they were there. Always just beyond the firelight, pressed against the walls, listening, waiting. And sometimes, in the long stretches of silence, one of them would speak. Not in a growl. Not in some bestial snarl. In a voice. A familiar one. We sealed the lower tunnels after that. The grates, the passageways, the shafts leading deeper. Anything that could be blocked, we blocked. But it wasn't enough. The scratching continued. The dragging. The soft, rhythmic tapping that always came in threes. And then, one night, the whispering began. It came from the barricades first. Soft at first, just on the edge of hearing. Then closer, rising and falling like breath. It used names. Real names. Names of the dead. And sometimes, names of the living. I started to understand then. The air was wrong, thick with something that wasn't just dust. It carried weight, an infection of the mind as much as the body. It seeped into the lungs, the skin, the bones. It changed people, and those who had been here the longest, those who had been trapped since the first wave, those who had gone missing, they weren't missing at all. They had simply stopped being human. A girl disappeared. She had been one of the quieter ones, barely speaking, always staying close to the fires. She had been sleeping when it happened. A soft rustling in the dark, the shifting of fabric. No screams, no signs of struggle, just an empty space where she had been. No one searched. We knew what we would find. We sat in silence that night, huddled close, watching the barricades. The scratching continued, the dragging, the rhythmic tapping, and then a voice, soft, whispering, the girl's name, followed by 3 slow knocks. The barricade shuddered, and we knew, then, that the deep ones weren't outside. Not anymore. They were already among us. Hope is the most dangerous thing down here. It keeps you moving long after you should have stopped. It whispers in your ear that there's something ahead, an escape, a salvation, when all you're walking toward is another grave. But it was hope that pushed me to volunteer. The map was real. Someone had drawn it long before the world ended, detailing maintenance tunnels that stretched far beneath the ruins. One path led to Union Station. There had been supplies there once, stashed away in storerooms beneath the tracks. If even a fraction remained, it would be enough to keep us alive a little longer. No one wanted to go. The tunnels were death. We all knew it. But sitting in the dark, waiting for starvation to claim us, was worse. So I went. There were 4 of us, each carrying makeshift weapons, rusted pipes, scavenged knives, things that would do little good against what lurked in the dark. But it was something, a symbol of defiance, if nothing else. We moved in silence. The deeper we went, the colder it got. The tunnels past our settlement were untouched. No signs of life. No footprints in the dust. Just the ruins of what had once been a city's veins, long abandoned, long forgotten. We passed skeletal trains, their metal frames frozen in time, shattered glass glinting in the dim light of our torches. The air was heavy with something I couldn't name, not just the weight of dust and decay, but something older, something waiting. Then the walls began to change. At first it was subtle, patches of discoloration, dark smears against concrete that pulsed faintly when our lights passed over them. Then the growths began, flesh-like, vet, spreading along the tunnels like veins. Some curled inward, like something had burrowed beneath them. Others stretched toward us, quivering as we passed. One of the men ran his hand over them. The skin on his palm split open a day later. The deeper we went, the more the walls breathed. Union Station was close. We had been walking for hours, past rusting infrastructure and forgotten maintenance rooms, past things we didn't want to look at too closely. The tunnels twisted, narrowing in places, forcing us to move single file. That was when we heard it. A voice. A woman, whispering for help. We should have run. We should have ignored her. But we didn't. It was ahead of us, around a bend. Faint, trembling, barely more than a breath. It called out again, desperate, pleading. We stepped forward. The tracks were empty. The tunnel stretched into the black, undisturbed. But the whispering continued. Right behind us, something grabbed the last man in line. It was fast. Too fast. One moment he was there. The next, a wet, tearing sound filled the tunnel, and he was gone. We turned our lights back toward the passage, expecting to see him struggling, reaching for help. But there was nothing. No blood. No body. Just the faintest ripple in the air, like something had passed through and taken him with it. Then the whispering started again. The same voice. The same plea. But now it was using his name. Panic nearly broke us. We had seen what happened to those who ran. The tunnels didn't let you leave. They twisted, folded in on themselves, led you in circles until you collapsed from exhaustion. So we didn't run. We moved forward, forcing ourselves not to listen, not to look back. Union Station had to be close. The tunnel opened into something larger. A cavernous space, barely illuminated by our dim torches. It had once been part of the station, maybe an old storeroom or a secondary platform. Piles of abandoned luggage littered the floor. Torn, looted. Rusted carts stood frozen mid-motion, their wheels fused to the floor with age and filth. And at the far end, something stood waiting. It wasn't moving. Not yet. Just standing. Watching. It wasn't human. Not anymore. The first thing I noticed was the eyes. Too wide. Too round. Reflecting the light in an unnatural way, like glass or something worse. The skin stretched too thin over an elongated frame. Long arms hanging motionless at its sides. The mouth, if it was a mouth, was slightly open, as if waiting to speak. We didn't move. It didn't move. And then the whispering returned. Not from it. From behind us. The same voice. The same plea. And now another voice joined it. A man's. The one we had lost. They were calling for us. The thing twitched. A shudder. A slight tilt of the head. Then it rushed us. We didn't fight. There was no time, no thought, only instinct. We ran. The tunnels warped around us. Every turn felt wrong. Every passage led somewhere it shouldn't. The voices followed, growing louder, more frantic, blending together in a discordant chorus of pleading. The thing behind us never stopped, never slowed, not running, not chasing, just following, keeping pace, as if waiting for something. We saw the entrance too late. A door frame, half buried in rubble. The remnants of an old maintenance room. We lunged toward it, scrambling over debris, squeezing through the narrow gap just as the air behind us shifted. Something passed through the space where we had been. The whispering stopped. We slammed the door shut. The room was small. A supply closet, maybe. Rusted shelves lined the walls. Old uniforms and scattered papers littering the floor. We didn't speak. We barely breathed. And then we heard it. Not a whisper. Not a voice. Breathing. Just beyond the door. Slow. Rhythmic. Waiting. The air grew thick. Heavy. We pressed against the far wall, weapons raised. Not that they would do anything. The breathing continued. A slow inhale. A long exhale. Then the doorknob turned. Nothing happened. The door didn't open. The breathing didn't stop. The handle turned slowly. Then back. Then again. A rhythmic motion. Like someone testing the lock. Like someone waiting for an invitation. It continued for hours. We never slept. And we never opened the door. The breathing stopped just before dawn. Not all at once. It faded, like fog retreating with the sunrise, slow and deliberate. A final exhale, then nothing. We didn't move at first. We had learned our lesson. Sometimes things only pretended to leave. But the silence held. When we finally opened the door, the tunnel was empty. No sign of pursuit, no whispers lingering in the dust. Just the path ahead, winding toward Union Station. So we walked. The tunnels led us deeper into what had once been the beating heart of the underground. This was where the trains had converged, a hub for thousands of commuters that now lay still and breathless beneath the weight of the earth. Union Station was close. We could feel it, but the city had changed. The tunnels were wrong, stretched too long, curving in ways that didn't make sense. We should have reached the station an hour ago. Instead, we walked in silence, passing the remains of collapsed passageways and empty train cars frozen in time. The walls pulsed with faint light. The same fleshy growths from before, thicker now, spreading like veins through the concrete. They twitched as we passed. The air became heavier, metallic. Then we saw the opening, a vast, jagged wound in the ceiling of the station, where something had torn through steel and concrete like paper. Beyond it, the sky. We had reached the surface. The city was gone. Where buildings had once stood, there were only skeletal remains, blackened structures of twisted steel and shattered glass. The streets were smooth, melted, fused into a rippling sea of onyx, reflecting the pale light of a sickly sky. Ash fell in slow spirals, an endless, silent snowfall of radioactive dust. And the bodies, they weren't whole. They weren't even there, not really. Only shadows remained, scorched outlines seared into the pavement, frozen mid-motion. People who had been standing, walking, waiting for something that never came. Their last moments, captured in an instant, burned into the earth as the heat erased their bodies. Some were reaching out. Others were holding hands. A child sat on the steps of a ruined building, his outline small, hunched over something that no longer existed. We didn't step on them. It felt wrong. We weren't alone. At first, it was just a feeling. The prickling weight of unseen eyes, the certainty of being watched. Then we saw it, a figure standing in the ruins. Motionless, not hidden, not lurking, just waiting. It stood at the edge of a collapsed intersection, where the road had caved in, leaving a jagged maw of blackness leading to nowhere. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs were too thin, stretched beyond human proportions, draped in something that might have once been clothing but had fused to its form, tattered and burned. And its face, there wasn't one. No features, just smooth, polished glass where skin should have been, reflecting the empty city around it. It watched without watching. We stepped back, and the path behind us was gone. The tunnels had shifted. The way we came was no longer there, replaced by a sheer drop into darkness. The only way forward was through the city, and the figure was still waiting. We walked, not toward it, not directly, but the city funneled us, its ruins narrowing, its streets leading in only one direction. The air shimmered with heat that shouldn't have been there, warping the distance, making shapes blur at the edges. The figure didn't move, but we knew better than to trust stillness. The further we went, the more the city changed. The streets became too smooth, too reflective. The buildings lost their details, their windows merging into seamless black glass. Then the shadows started to move. Not the ones on the ground, the ones in the ground. They shifted beneath our feet, stretching when they shouldn't, twisting in ways that didn't match our movements. Some had too many arms. Some had mouths that gaped open in silent screams. The figure watched. We reached an intersection. 4 paths, each identical, each stretching into the ruins, curving away before disappearing into the haze of falling ash. We turned back. The figure was closer, not by much, but enough. We had not seen it move. We chose a direction at random. The roads were empty. The shadows twisted. The glass shimmered. The figure remained. Time blurred. The sun never moved. The ash never stopped falling. Every street led back to itself. The figure was always near, waiting at the edges of sight. Then for the first time it moved, a slow tilt of the head. The glass of its face rippled, and something inside it shifted. A reflection, not of the city, of us. We ran, not toward anything, just away. The city twisted, its roads turning in on themselves. The buildings lost shape, their outlines dissolving, shifting. We weren't in the ruins anymore. We were inside something else, and the figure was waiting ahead. Closer. The reflection inside it became clearer. Not us. Something else. Something behind us. Something reaching. We hit a barrier. An invisible wall. The glass around us trembled, distorting, forming shapes. Faces pressed against the surface. Mouths open. Eyes wide. The shadows beneath us lengthened, stretching toward our feet. The figure raised one hand. The glass in its face began to crack. And behind the fractures, something pushed to get out. Something that looked like me. The city was a mirage. Not in the way of heat rising from asphalt. Not in the way of shifting reflections in warped glass. It was a mirage in the way that something dead can still hold an echo of life. Because this wasn't a city anymore. It was a tomb. The figure's face was breaking. Thin cracks spread across the glass, fine as hairline fractures in a skull. The thing behind it, inside it, was pressing against the surface, eager, stretching toward me through its own reflection. And then the glass shattered. There was no sound, no tinkling shards hitting the ground, just the sudden collapse of the thing's face into nothingness. And behind the emptiness, a tunnel leading down. I stepped forward. I didn't want to, but I did. The ground beneath my feet wasn't solid anymore. It had never been. The roads, the ruins, the shimmering streets, they had only been the surface of something much deeper. Something waiting beneath. And now it had opened for me. The others, if they were still there, were silent. Maybe they had never been here at all. Maybe they had never survived the tunnels, never walked through the glass-blasted ruins, never stood frozen in the reflection of something that shouldn't exist. Maybe I had been alone this whole time. Maybe I'd always been down here. The tunnel swallowed me. The descent wasn't physical. It wasn't walking downward into some cavernous depth. It wasn't stepping into a pit beneath the city. It was falling, not through space, through memory, through something older than thought, deeper than bone, through the train station, through the last moments before the blast, through the crowd waiting for their morning commute, through the flash of heat and light, through death. I had never left the tunnels. Not truly. The city above was an echo, an afterimage burned into what was left of my mind, a dream stretched thin over something that refused to wake. Because the city wasn't above. It had never been above. It had always been down here. And so had I. They were waiting. The ones who had stayed behind. They had no eyes, but they saw. They had no mouths, but they spoke. Shapes moved through the tunnels. Elongated limbs shifting in the dark. Bodies stretched too thin, too long, as if they had been pulled apart and reassembled without knowing what a human was supposed to be. But I knew them. I had always known them. They were the people from the station, the ones who had been buried in the collapse, the ones who had screamed for help before the dust sealed their throats, the ones who had wandered too deep, searching for a way out, only to find that there was no exit, only down, only this. One of them stepped forward, taller than the rest, draped in remnants of what might have once been skin, stretched thin over a form that had long forgotten its own shape. It whispered my name, and I remembered. I had died that day. We all had. The blast had buried the station, had twisted steel and concrete into a coffin too deep to escape. The ones who suffocated in the dust were the lucky ones. The rest of us had changed. Not all at once. At first, it had been the hunger, then the cold, then the whispers, then the moment we forgot where the sky had been, and then the moment we no longer cared. The figure reached out, not in greeting, not in threat, in recognition, in acceptance. The glass city had never been real. The surface had never been real. There was nothing left up there. There had never been anything left. There was only this, only the hollow beneath. And now it was time to join them, to stop pretending, to let go. I stepped forward, and I stopped remembering.